From one of my previous videos about what Union soldiers thought of slavery, I received many comments, some of which that had absolutely no relevance to my video whatsoever, and others that said the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery, that it was really about states' rights, taxes, and that both North and South had slaves, so clearly it couldn't have been about slavery. So I decided to make this video on how to explain that the Civil War was indeed over slavery. To understand the lead up to the Civil War, you must look at one event that was over expanding slavery: Bleeding Kansas. This took place in 1854 when anti- and pro-slavery forces fought over whether or not Kansas would be a slave state. But before the fighting began, there was voting. Since the Kansas-Nebraska Act made popular sovereignty the deciding factor on any slave issue, many border ruffians from the neighboring state of Missouri rode into Kansas to vote for a pro-slavery constitution. After the voting was done, the tally showed that there were more votes than there were actual legal residents in the entire state. Abolitionists realized that there was foul play, and so they decided to create their own capital in a new free constitution. This led to open warfare and brought the attention of the entire nation. Abolitionists and pro-slavery militants headed to the state to support their desired causes. One key figure that went was John Brown, one of the most radical anti-slavery advocates at the time. Leaders in Congress also spoke of the issue concerning the violence in Kansas. Senator Charles Sumter spoke of his concerns of the slave power fighting to control the state and the worry of slavery's expansion west. The key takeaway from this event is that it was totally over whether Kansas would be a free or slave state. People literally began killing each other to expand or contain slavery. Arguably, this was the real beginning of the Civil War, but we'll stick with 1861 for now. Bleeding Kansas was a key event, but it was part of something much larger, mostly on a hemispherical scale, because of other efforts that were made to expand slavery to South America. For example, William Walker and his filibusters, just like the border ruffians, were trying to take over Nicaragua and make it a slave nation that would be annexed by the United States. They did succeed, but were eventually overthrown. At the same time, many deep Southerners had their sights on the island of Cuba. Politicians began to notice. One in particular was Stephen Douglas. Though Douglas was the leader of the popular sovereignty movement, he still wanted to win Southern support to eventually become president. He knew the South wanted Cuba because it had perfect land to build plantations on and would make it easier for slave ships from Africa to travel to the Gulf of Mexico without being caught. Douglas spoke openly to take Cuba, peaceably or by force, but he continued to retain his stance on letting new Western states choose freedom or slavery to keep his Northern support. This angered the South, which cost him the election of 1860. The winner of the election, Abraham Lincoln, ran on the platform of preventing the expansion of slavery. This platform caused almost all Southern states to not include him on the presidential ballot. Nevertheless, he won enough Northern states to take the presidency. Southerners were deeply concerned because of this. Lincoln would not concede to allow slavery to expand outside of the South. Democratic leaders in Congress appealed to Republicans to pass compromises to prevent disunion. The Crittenden Compromise was presented in the hope that the line that made up the Missouri Compromise would be extended westward to the Utah Territory, allowing states under the line to be slave and above it free. Lincoln and Republicans obviously refused to pass it. As Lincoln told his friend Alexander Stephens, "On the territorial question, I am inflexible. On that, there is a difference between you and us, and it is the only substantial difference. You think slavery is right and ought to be extended. We think it is wrong and ought to be restricted." Along with the Crittenden Compromise was the Corwin Amendment, which would have protected slavery in the areas where the institution already existed. Republicans were willing to compromise on that, and it did pass Congress. But without the allowance of expansion west or anywhere, the southern states seceded before they could even ratify the amendment. If the institution of slavery could not grow, then the only other option was to leave to create a new nation. As slave states began to leave the Union, they cited slavery as the reason. 6 states quickly seceded before Lincoln was even inaugurated. South Carolina was the first state to leave, followed by Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. Now, Louisiana and Florida also seceded, but did not mention a tax on slavery as their causation. But Florida did have a document that detailed explicitly that it was the cause for leaving. Now, granted, that declaration of causes did not pass, but the president over their convention stated that staying in the Union would mean the destruction of every vestige of right growing out of property in slaves. The states formed a new government, and its vice president, Alexander Stephens, explained why in the Cornerstone speech. The Confederate Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the N-word in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. In other parts of Stephens' speech, he recognized that the Confederate Constitution made changes to how tariffs and taxes would be passed into law because it was an issue they had with the U.S. Constitution's method of implementation. However, the Vice President of the Confederacy did not cite that reason for secession, but simply laid it at the feet of slavery. On April 12th, the militia of South Carolina opened fire on Fort Sumter after the Lincoln administration decided to send supplies to aid the troops there. There was much debate whether to abandon the fort or maintain it. William Seward, the Secretary of State, wanted to remove all federal soldiers to not scare away the remaining slave states. Lincoln did not think that reinforcing Sumter was an issue relating to slavery, but the compromise was to send food. The ships went in, signaling that the federal government had no intention of giving up Sumter. The order was then given to fire on the island, and thus the war began. After Lincoln called for the raising of 75,000 troops, 4 more states decided to join the Confederacy, citing the North's oppression. Of those states, only Virginia mentioned that the oppression was against the slaveholding states. Even though the others lacked the mention of slavery, we can see that the areas that had the most slaves were the supporters of secession. For example, we know that in the areas that had more than 25% of the slave population in Tennessee and Virginia had the most support. Days after Sumter, the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, affirmed that they believed that slavery was indeed under attack to the Confederate Congress. As soon as the northern states that prohibited African slavery within their limits had reached a number sufficient to give their representation a controlling voice in the Congress, a persistent and organized system, hostile measures against the rights of the owners of slaves in the southern states was inaugurated and gradually extended. With an interest of such overwhelming magnitude, imperiled, the people of the southern states were driven by the conduct of the North to the adoption of some course of action to avert the danger with which they were openly menaced. You've seen the evidence that pro-slavery leaders wanted to secede to preserve and expand the institution of slavery. They were willing to go to war, to fight to protect their way of life. Now, I would in the video here, but I want to look at the sequence of events that I have already talked about, along with the other evidence that counters my point. Looking from the beginning of the war and the end, we see that in 1860, states chose to leave the Union. In 1861, Alexander Stephens said it was about slavery, and Jefferson Davis said the war was about slavery. Confederates refused to allow any slaves to serve in the military and be freed. In 1863, they changed their minds somewhat. After the war, Stephens and Davis made it clear that the whole reason of the war was about states' rights. So what caused such a change of heart? That it was about slavery, but then a noble cause of freedom? What happened between these events? What happened in July 1863? Well, the Union Army defeated the Confederates at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The tide had turned against the Confederacy, and many of its soldiers deserted by the thousands, at a higher rate than even Federal troops. After that, in 1865, what happened? The slave states lost. They lost. Many ex-Confederates changed the narrative because they wanted to save their reputations. If they would have won, they would have most likely kept the same story. Don't forget to like, comment, and share, as well as subscribing to this channel.